All right, let's get to it.
All right, so here we are at the next step of our hobby box project. We've got this thing all glued up. It's all dry. Joints are tight. I'm ready to sand this thing. So the program on the CNC router has been intentionally designed so that these fingers come together slightly proud of each other, and that makes it so that we just have a little touch to sand off on the fingers, and hopefully we don't actually have much to sand off on the actual field of the plywood itself. We want to be really careful how much we sand on the faces of the plywood, because the veneers that make up this plywood are really thin. We don't want to sand through and then end up with different colors of the plywood layers or veneers that make up, and it doesn't look very great. Okay, so we actually want to be very careful when we sand this, not to sand too much and not to sand with too much pressure. Okay, so I know sanding seems like one of those things, like why do we need to do a video on this or a demo on this, but there's a couple of tips here that are really important. Another tip is that we need to make sure that the sander stays really nice and flat. I know sometimes there's a tendency for us to want to sort of really grind something out or like push hard sideways. Don't do that, because you're going to go right through that veneer and you're going to make a big dip and it's not going to be good. Or when we get to the edge, when we get around the edge of the box, we don't want this thing coasting over. We don't want our sander coasting over and making this thing all rounded and mushy. We actually want it really crisp and flat. We just want our surfaces cleaned off. So when we do that, when we approach the edge of this thing, we're going to make sure that we keep the sander really nice and flat the whole way without resisting the urge to coast over top of it. Let's talk sanders. I've got 4 brand new sanders for you guys. They have a Velcro pad on them. Okay, so it's really important that we make sure that there's actually sandpaper on here before we start sanding. If we sand with a piece of the sandpaper ripped off or not even there at all, we're just going to burn over the actual hooks on the pad, and then sandpaper won't stick to it anymore. So let's please make sure that there's actually a full piece of sandpaper on there before we start sanding with it. I've got, as I have 4 sanders, we've got 2 that are set up with a coarse 80 grit disc and 2 that are set up with a finer 180 grit disc. So we're going to kind of leave them set up like that. We'll have 2 coarse ones, 2 fine ones, and then you guys can just trade back and forth as you need the different ones. Okay, so obviously we're going to start with a coarse 80 grit just to knock down the heavy stuff first, and we're going to switch to the 180 to finish it off. Okay, I got safety glasses on. I'm actually going to wear earmuffs for this as well, because I might be here for a prolonged amount of time. I want to make sure I'm protecting my ears. And here we go. Okay, so you guys notice I kept the sander moving. I didn't leave it in one place, really, or at least not for very long. I want to keep this thing moving. And I can tell that I'm done sanding when all of my joints look totally flush and there's no, or feel totally flush, and there's also no yellow glue haze left. Oftentimes what you guys will see is that just as a byproduct of actually gluing this thing together, we get these little sort of hazes of yellow around the joints. And we want to make sure that that's all gone. And sure enough, it is. All my glue is gone, joints feel flush, and I didn't sand through the plywood. So that's a success. Now I'm going to move on to another face and go for it again. One last thing before I let you guys go. You'll notice that I'm actually here at our sanding table. So this is where I want you guys to actually do all of this work. It's a perforated table on this thing, and our dust collector actually comes and will suck all the dust down through the table and out into the dust collection system. So it just keeps the dust level in our shop down. Okay, so that is sanding your box.